Hi, this is Paul. I had a conversation with Julian last week, but the conversation had too much personal stuff in it for his taste for me to release it on the channel or even in the membership section. So he does have the video. Those of you who know Julian, if he asks to see it, that's up to him. He does have the video in an unlisted link, but he did give me permission to share some pieces of it. We talked about the CRC. He has been attending a Christian college, and I thought this section on talking about what has happened to Christian colleges was really fascinating. And he sort of, as usually conversations do, he sort of made me see something that I hadn't really seen before. The part of what's been going on in the Christian Reformed Church is that let's look at the second half of the 20th century. The Second World War was fought, and at the end of the Second World War, many Christian Reformed young people in the boomer generation were growing up on farms in rural areas. They were growing up in a Christian Reformed church that enforced its rules. And so Sabbatarianism was enforced, sexual ethics were enforced. If a young woman got pregnant, she and the young man would have to stand up and publicly confess in front of the congregation. These were a number of practices that went away in the latter part of the 20th century. Depending on exactly where the church was, those practices went away. Now, Calvin College then had sort of a special role. I think the educational institutions were set up to be reinforcers of the church institutions. In the Christian Reformed Church, the Christian day schools were set up independent of the church. They were run by parents. And as the 20th century progressed, that became more and more important. Parents were running the Christian day schools, and as numbers were declining in the Christian Reformed Church, these schools survived by opening themselves up, usually to other evangelical groups or even to just parents who wanted an alternative to public education. Calvin College, now Calvin University, was in many ways, when I think about it during the boomer years, it was the place where kids would leave the farm, leave the shelter of their conservative community, and over time in the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s, Calvin tended to release more and more, as the church did, its expectations and its grip on students. For a long time, there were dances in Calvin dorm basements. Dancing was something that a 1920s synodical report of worldly amusements condemned, but there were unofficial dances that were in the dorms. While I was at Calvin, finally, officially, the college could have dances. Chapels were no longer mandatory. When I was at Calvin, there was very much a sense of, well, this is Christian liberty, and you're starting into your adult years. The in loco parentis was slowly receding, and so for many people who grew up in conservative places, they would get to Christian college, which the parents looked like as at least a little buffer in loco parentis, where they'd get a Christian education and all of this. There'd be some boundaries on there. And I think especially during the boomer years, as the boomers themselves began to be the professors, there was, in a sense, you wanted to do sort of a Christian radicalization of the kids coming up from the farms. And so the idea was that the college would be just a little bit more progressive, a little bit more liberal. The college would be a safe space to open up the students to a bigger world and, as I've written before, sort of lead them into transformationalism. I'm going to append onto this video a little portion of the conversation that I had with Julian. I'll sort of leave that at an ending. This video was going to be just maybe just a few introductory comments and then that, but the further I go with this, the more I want to get into some stuff that I wrote on Voices, because I think it actually weaves into this. So part of the discussion that I have on Voices with my friend David Snapper. David was on the channel in very early years when he talked about his Unhurt course. Is about leadership, and for the last decade of turmoil in the Christian Reformed Church, David would continually ask the question about where's the leadership in the Christian Reformed Church. And in a previous posting, I mentioned that with now the synod drawing this bright line, and a whole group of churches, many of whom have provided leadership for the Christian Reformed Church, they are exiled involuntarily. There will be a leadership transition where new leaders will emerge. And David sort of challenged me and said, well, where are the old leaders? And this is a piece that I wrote a couple mornings ago. When we judge the effectiveness of leadership, we are usually looking for outcomes. I think the fractured mission or diverse missions of the CRC for the period since the Second World War are a helpful way of evaluating leadership in the church. On previous posts, I had gone into some of the different factions and missions, and many of those missions are sort of intertwined. So again, what has been various theological streams in the Christian Reformed Church? What have been the various theological streams in the Christian Reformed Church and their desired outcomes? Also, again, many individuals in individual churches held multiple missions. Sometimes they rose together, sometimes competed, etc. Mileage varied. I think each also sought well-being in different frames and visions. The Transformationalists, and I've mentioned these in previous videos, where very much Calvin College's mission was to equip Christian Reformed students, some of them coming from the farm or from, when Hudsonville, Michigan was farms. I mean, that's part of what has happened is places that had been farms have been urbanized in the Christian Reformed Church. Bellflower, California, Chino, California, all over the country. Even North Jersey had farms which were going out of existence when I was a young man. High visibility mission for the Christian Reformed Church since the Second World War. I think probably the war experience created a particular well-being blend of peace, prosperity, and justice. There's a lot of Michael Satori's Boomorality in this vision. They sought these goals through institutional development, often to relieve suffering. And part of this is sort of getting swept up in the emergence of the American empire after the Second World War. Now you have the Marshall Plan that has to rebuild Europe, and America has to rebuild Japan. America sort of leaned into befriending and rebuilding its adversaries in the Second World War to quickly turn them around into allies for the succeeding Cold War battles, for example, in Asia, in Korea, and then Vietnam. They needed Japan. And of course, Japan is now a stalwart ally and a buffer against China. And so America, just as America as a nation sort of became an empire, imperialism and sort of an imperialist Christian vision infused many small ethnic denominations like the Christian Reformed Church. Whereas before the Second World War, the goal of Christian Reformed churches was to create a series of institutions by which the children of the immigrants and their children would be formed and shaped in the way of their version of Christianity and their culture and their lifestyle. And so before the Second World War, many ethnic denominations basically had that mission. And that mission obviously didn't just sort of abruptly end after the Second World War. There's a slow transformation. In many ways, the boomer generation, boy, my 3 conversations today, 2 of them are already in No Wait, No Ads, have all been about boomers and with boomers. So there's a lot of Michael Satori's Boomorality in this vision. They sought these goals through institutional development, often to relieve suffering. Suffering, wars are made of suffering, was the big evil to abolish. Of course, the civil rights movement was fueled also by stories of the suffering of African Americans at the hands of white America via racism. Then on to suffering women at the hands of men and gays at the hands of straights, and. A big part of the post-World War II transformationalist vision required development and alignment of political institutions and platforms. Transformationalist activism involved getting the church to participate in larger societal movements whose outcomes were secured by political power. A lot of the grumbling over the last 20, 30 years from the confessionalists in the Christian Reformed Church has been that the Office of Social Justice and the Banner and various other agencies, what they seem pretty much mostly interested in is getting, of course, there's always the American-Canadian divide and the fighting over that, but it always seems to center on American elections. And of course, all of that was tremendously inflamed by Trump, who was quite a bit more bombastic, let's say, than George W. Bush. But a lot of that just seemed to be about what we really need the church for is to mobilize votes for American political elections. That's what we need the church for. And for, let's say, people who were inclined to vote Democratic in the Christian Reformed Church rather than Republican, which probably 70 to 75% of the Christian Reformed Church reliably votes Republican. The mission of the church was basically to mobilize people coming out of conservative churches and get them to flip from red to blue and then vote for the other party. And, I remember, I won't tell too many tales out of school. Some of the people that I'm about to tell tales are watching, and so I have to be a little careful. I think a lot of the CRC's leadership horsepower since World War II was spent on delivering these outcomes. And again, it wasn't, the Christian Reformed Church, I think, has done far better than average in terms of avoiding naked political partisanship. But there was very much that undercurrent. I have yet to read Megan Basham's Shepherds for Sale. I really have to download the Kindle version so I can find certain portions instead of just working my way through the audiobook. But I've been in many Christian Reformed circles where the basic assumption is, it's all of those people in the Christian Reformed Church who vote the right way, and what we really have to do is change their mind and transform them into voting the right way. And of course, there are issues within the Christian Reformed Church, turn them from against women in office to for women in office, and basically a bunch of these things. And a lot of the CRC's leadership horsepower was a very soft, kind, gentle, some from the conservative side would argue not so soft, kind, and gentle, but a way of sort of growing up the rest of the church into the mind that the enlightened elites had. And basically what the Christian Reformed Church was, well, I used to be them and now I'm this. I once was blind and now I see. And so in many ways, the mission of that group of the church was change the minds of the other people in the church. In the end, it didn't matter if your children or your neighbors were worshiping or supporting the CRC, as long as they were good people. And what good people did was vote a certain way and support certain causes out there in the world and recite certain cultural liturgies like Black Lives Matter or Trans Lives Matter, or we've got to cut carbon emissions, or, many of these liturgies. And now, for some of the critique that I did of Eric Weinstein, he had a point.
They don't really, whatever it is not really trying to fool you. It's trying to instruct you. You're allowed to see the truth. They can make it difficult to find the truth, but it's hard to shut up Joe Rogan. They've settled for something else, which is, think about MSNBC and CNN, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, Reuters, AP, etc., as a set of instructions for how to keep your job. You're allowed to disagree. We'll set the boundaries of the disagreement. We'll set the topics of the disagreement. You may not even watch any of these things, but we'll make sure that it filters through to the people that you are watching so that they're outraged. And you're given a choice. You can choose to understand whatever you want, and you can choose to say whatever you want. But if you say what you understand to be true, you can know what the consequences are. You may lose your marriage. You may lose your job. You may lose your friends. And so, in essence, we all know that if you question the war in Ukraine, or if you say, look, I detest Donald Trump, but I'm voting for him because what's going on in the Democratic Party is unholy and insane. You're signing up for whatever Thanksgiving dinner we have planned for you.
And in a sense, obviously in the Christian Reformed Church, this, what he describes as now, you have to shift this back. But in the Christian Reformed Church, of course, it was sort of a 70-30. Let's say the 30% might vote for the Democrats and the 70% would vote for the Republicans. And so, and the 30% seemed to hold the commanding heights of the banner, and they'd win Senate votes, and they had the college. And so in that sense, even though it was 70-30, it was sort of a fair fight. And then, of course, all of that changed in Synod 2022. And a lot of the CRC horsepower was sort of designed for that. Now, again, and people have critiqued this already on Voices and saying, well, that's reductive and simplistic. Yeah, it is. It's, I don't know, 800 words. That's 7,100 characters. If I write a 10,000 word thing for Voices, which I have in the past, then I get complaints that nobody's going to read this long thing. Fair enough. The confessionalist remnant vision, a competing earlier vision in the Christian Reformed Church, was the one where the CRC as an institution was designed to preserve persons, often subsequent generations of the CRC, to embody the religious confessions and practices of their parents. Immigration strengthened this. This too was a vision of well-being, but with a fuller sense of, with a fuller vision of afterlife as well. In other words, the transformationalist vision tended to be, well, okay, we're going to focus. It was secularizing. It was this world. The afterlife vision, the confessional vision was, well, you might suffer in this world, and the Christian Reformed Church might continue to be a small, unimportant denomination. But we all knew that when we got to college, or not we got to college, that when we got to heaven, St. Peter was going to say, oh, the Christian Reformed Church, like in the, like the frequent flyer line in the airport, you get to walk on the red carpet because you're the Christian Reformed Church. And there were other communities around the Christian Reformed Church that had jokes about the Christian Reformed Church because my wife grew up in a group of Baptists in Grand Rapids who had jokes about the Christian Reformed Church because there are so many of them around Grand Rapids and there weren't as many Baptists. And they would make jokes like, oh, when you get to heaven, when a CRC person walks by, the angels shush you because they say they think they're the only ones here. But the vision was that strong. We had the right theology. We had the compelling vision. And what we really needed to do was hand this down to our children. And, whatever happened in the world, certainly we wanted our church to grow and our perspective to grow. But for the most part, job A was preserve the community. That was the main thing. Whereas the transformationalists were much more, we've got to save the world. We've got to transform the world. We've got to relieve suffering. We've got to relieve suffering in the poor. We've got to relieve suffering that may be caused by climate change. We've got to relieve suffering, blah, 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 blah. Suffering in this world for the cause would be rewarded in eternity. The church, the schools, the publishing, the church discipline, etc., was all designed to keep the doctrine of the Christian Reformed Church and the practices that were passed on, like Sabbatarianism, from generation to generation. We were a remnant in a strange land and needed to preserve this. The goal of this vision was not so much the moral performance and the anti-suffering outcomes of vast institutions and causes beyond the church, but our churches themselves and their ability to replicate human belief and behavior into subsequent generations. In other words, one of the things, let's see if I put it in here. I didn't put it in here. I'll have to grab it. I can't find it right now. Snapper usually has the numbers. In 1963, the Christian Reformed Church had roughly half as many churches and about the same number of people. The church peaked in terms of number of people in the 1990s. I've got the dog with me. By now, the church has about the same number of people that it had in 1963 before the big baby boom in the Christian Reformed Church of all those births. But it has twice as many churches, meaning that the churches are smaller. Well, this stands to reason if the churches are supposed to be platforms to transform the world versus the churches are supposed to be containment units designed to preserve a certain set of beliefs and a certain way of life. The church order, especially before he changed so much of it, was a record of this mission. Again, I remember reading the church order, an assignment at Calvin Seminary, and the job, and write a little paper on it. I said, this document is designed to preserve doctrinal fidelity. That is what this whole thing is for. And, well, but the church itself, and especially something like Calvin College and University, was designed to transform the world. These were other missions. There were other missions too that came alongside and threaded within. Evangelical soul saving was pretty easily adapted to the confessional remnant vision, except we were just happy if our kids went to a Bible-believing church. Dunamis charismatic visions could fit in. The real evidence of God's presence were healing and mystical experience. Efforts at well-being were always a part of every mission, but they focused often on different things. But I think for this argument, the two main rivals are the Transformationists versus the confessional remnant visions. In that, the leadership question with respect to outcomes is clearer. The Transformationalists in many ways were the successor vision from the confessional remnant, and winning issues at Synod and winning confessionalists for Transformationalist causes and positions were the goal. Sure, you could still have your cherished beliefs about the confessions, but what really mattered was that you elected the right politicians to halt global warming and support liberationist causes. Frankly, it didn't matter that much, depending on the mixtures, whether or not you went to church, as long as you were on the right side of history in terms of relieving suffering. The abortion issue is interesting because in the imaginary of many, it is a victimless crime because no one suffers. The more the anti-abortion team could make this battle over a certain vision of suffering, the more traction they could get. Look at the euthanasia battles. Suffering, death and suffering, and so therefore euthanasia, death is good. The Transformationalists for the Transformationalists, it's missiological for the CRC to spend its capital, human, financial, attention, etc., on causes beyond the CRC, and in development of platforms beyond the CRC. Calvin and World Renew were exceptions to this because they were engines of the sort of transformation envisioned by the tribe. Look at how many exiles have not for a long time worshipped in the CRC, or anywhere for some, but are deeply invested in this fight, especially for the sake of Calvin University. Many of them taught there. It's hard to know yet what the particular mix of new confessionalists are because they have plenty of transformationalist DNA in them, but their outcomes differ a bit. There is a vision of well-being in the competing political conservatism of today in the evangelical church. Again, it's helpful to compare Christian Kobes Dumais, Jesus and John Wayne with Megan Basham's Shepherd for Sale, because the arguments for politically conservative causes are also often therapeutic in the ways the children of transformationalists could understand. The progressive transformationalist agenda wasn't delivered on the anti-suffering outcomes promised, hasn't delivered on that, so other visions of well-being have arisen. In other words, part of what is in American conservatism is just better for society. So in other words, it's not sort of this confessional remnant vision that the Christian Reformed Church had. It's a conservative transformationalist vision. We need to have laws against abortion. We need to continue to promote traditional gender norms. We need to continue to promote traditional values because we need to promote fossil fuels because it's better for society. An example of this is the argument against a lot of policies of the Green New Deal because these policies impact the poor by driving up energy and therefore food costs. The vision of avoiding climate change is carried at the expense of the poor and their suffering. So in other words, it's a conservative cause but a transformationalist outcome that is being sought. What overturned the hegemony of the post-World War II progressive transformationalists was a coalition. I don't know that this coalition will be the sort of builders of our institutions like the immigrants were. They have subsumed a lot of transformationalist code, but in a blend of a lot of tradition too. None of the born that notice the Born This Way piece. Somebody Bethel McGrew sent me the front page mag article. I'll put the link below. No, I wasn't born this way, which basically is a therapeutic homosexual sex addict argument against same-sex marriage. It's still anti-suffering. The new wave of religious conservatism that is happening right now in our culture is a subtle reblending of cultural winners. These post-progressive, post-liberals have basically created an evolutionary argument that there was wisdom in tradition that needs to be re-examined. It's basically what Jordan Peterson has done. What platforms, institutions will they build for the pursuit of their agendas? More churches, perhaps, maybe not. It's hard to know. But you can see this movement, and so now, in many ways, Christian colleges that have been platforms like Calvin University have been a platform for transformation, and to a degree also Julian's College, because when he listens to me talk about my stuff, he watches it happen in his own Anabaptist context, and he's like, oh, these same patterns are repeating. So I'll attach Julian's video, and let me know what you think.
Would have functioned as, I'm sure this is similar for Calvin. Like, this is a university that's pushing the boundaries. And what it needs to thrive is conservative kids coming in who have, rigid and fundamentalist views, and then it can kind of push them into in a bit of a more, into a better position. And what I see happening here is that they've spent a few generations pushing, and now they've pushed so far that the students who come are more liberal than the professors.
Yes.
And I find myself relating a lot more with the professors because they had a similar background than I did. Maybe not quite as conservative, but I think a lot of them grew up in a more conservative church, found a sort of middle position, and are kind of interested. And I see myself moving in a similar direction, but these other students, they're just a lot more liberal than I am. So like the theological understanding isn't there, the knowledge of scripture isn't there, it's quite something.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think you set it up well, and I think a lot of these patterns happen. So a lot of this happened after the Second World War. I would imagine that before, professors were sort of the gatekeepers for the tradition, and students and the college was then a way to reinforce the tradition so people would leave within the tradition. Part of what happened.
But you're forgetting we're pacifists, so we didn't really go off to war to meet the other people from the denomination.
But that doesn't mean you're not stewing in the same counterculture as the rest of the country. And I think
we wet people in the concept in the CEO camps.
But I think you said it well, that I think for a long time after the Second World War, students would go to college. Students from very conservative communities, often rural communities, would go to college and just loosen up a little bit. They would learn about a bigger world, but then they would sort of go out into the world and have families and things and settle down, and the kind of the pragmatic conservatism of going into middle age with a job and a family would sort of reset them. And so you had a little bit of movement in terms of that in the churches. And what's been happening is that the college expects to sort of be in that role. And now students are coming in with, wildly, at least for the subculture, the church subculture, with very different formations and demanding, this is where, college has often been a place of sexual experimentation.
Mhm.
But usually that was sexual experimentation with the opposite sex, although some I'm sure would play in other fields. But um, and because it's sort of a rite of passage place, and at least in the Christian Reformed Church, what happened in Calvin College is the Christian Reformed Church was large enough so that we would have kind of an ecology of colleges. So Calvin was sort of the more liberal of the colleges, and Dort was more conservative. And so Calvin would less be a nanny state. It was said, you're out of your house now. The college isn't going to make you. By the 1970s, the college no longer makes you go to chapel, no longer makes you go to church.
Uh-huh.
And so the college is a little bit of a CRC Rumspringa where you can play around with things, but the assumption is that at the end of college, you'll probably have your mate, and then you're going to go back to a place. And again, it'll be sort of the pragmatic conservatism of marriage and family. And that entire thing has been disrupted. And so the university doesn't know what role to play. And increasingly, there's for a college like that, there's no market demand for it, because now you're really competing with the public universities where it really is wild, or you're competing with the conservative universities that these are for people that really want a conservative school. And
Mhm.
so, I think in the current evolution of the culture war and the counterculture, colleges like Calvin University, they just don't know where they fit. And now in the Christian Reformed Church, that for the last 50, 60 years, Calvin was supposed to be a place that gave Christian Reformed people a world and life view and sort of sent them out as these transformationalists. But now the people come to the school already radicalized, and the transformation that they want to evoke in the church and in the world is already past. Now what Synod comes in and says, here's the line. You step over this line, you need to find another community. And so, I mean, basically what Synod did was basically draw a line, and 15% of what had been the best educated, the elite, the leaders of the Christian Reformed Church for the last 50 years, they're basically shown the door. And this group of people right now is just furious because, I mean, they don't know what to do, because they're so used to this internal dynamic of pushing against the man. Well, now the man basically drew the line and said, yeah, you push against some other man. and
You
and
mentioned
and
Nick Walterstorff. What was his how did he fit into all of this?
so Nick was one of the, like I said, the dream team. Him, Alvin Plantinga, George Marsden, Richard Mao. These were four lights that were
The
at
Four
Calvin, and
Horsemen.
the four horsemen. They were at Calvin in the 70s, and they, you know, they went out Harvard, Yale, Notre Dame, Fuller. They were the hometown kids that grew up and made it out into the big time. And they were right there, sort of the vanguard of this golden age of philosophy at Calvin. And then when this fight started, so the fight was actually going into 2016, but when when the when the transformationalists and the establishment began to realize they're in real trouble, they've been able to manage and eventually win every big war in the Christian Reformed Church. And by 2020, 2021 comes around, they begin to realize this isn't going like it should.
Hmm.
And so Nick Waltersdorf gives a major speech. You can find it on YouTube, to All One Body. And I remember, because I know people in this thing, and they were like, yeah, people aren't going to sort of, I mean, a banner editor, yeah, you might condemn him or something like that, but nobody's going to take on Nick Waltersdorf. And Nick Waltersdorf gives this speech, and basically his argument for, you know, the CRC sort of embracing same-sex marriage as as sort of the way that same-sex attracted people should live was, I've seen a lot of gay couples and they seem fine. I mean, that's his argument. And it's like, you're really gonna have to do something better than this. Even though that for many people and for most people is the main argument, that they say, we've tried it, it seems fine, let's just go with it. But
Mhm.
he's not,
I
but
I
you're
mean
not
when I
understanding the bigger conversation in the culture then.